Okay, this is lesson 4 or chapter 4, the drivers of the information security business, part 1. Part 1 contains a few more slides than part 2, so let's get started. The learning objective. Explain the information system security and its effect on people and businesses. The key concepts, risk management and approaches, business impact analysis or BIA, business continuity plan BCP, and disaster recovery plan DRP. The impact of risks, threats, and vulnerabilities on the IT infrastructure, adhering to compliance laws and governance, and managing and mitigating risk. So here's the introduction. Business drivers are elements in an organization that support business objectives. People. Well, we have a lot of people in an organization, and they're all working to try and sell our product, make a profit. Uh, Everybody from the president or CEO to financial people, to accounting, to marketing, to human resources, uh, research and development, all the way down to the manufacturing floor and the people that transport our uh, product to market. Of course, if we are not creating a product, but we're in the information business, then we don't have a manufacturing situation, but we still have people that are involved in creating something and trying to sell it, and people that are involved in trying to secure it. Now, the other thing we have to worry about as a business driver are the people that aren't in our organization, and those, of course, are our customers. Uh, our customers are important. We have to protect their information. We have to make it easy for them to uh, be able to purchase our product, to see our product. And so people are very important. And then they're the bad guys. We have to worry about the people that are going to um, try and access our information illegally. So people are very important. You can't take people out of the system. You cannot take people out of the organization. It's just something that we have to work through and work around and create policies to allow people to do their work securely. Information. So information is what we're really trying to protect here, but information is the lifeblood of an organization. We have to have access to the information in order to be able to know whether we're profitable and to be able to know whether we're going to go ahead and try and sell our product in a different location. Um, uh, Information with regard to who our competition is, and information has to be secured, and information may be in very many different locations in different formats. If we acquire a new company, we may acquire information that's in a different format than we have. So we have to secure the information, but we also have to manage the information. And conditions support our objectives. They include anything that supports business objectives. Conditions could be the state of the market of our product right now, the state of the market of our product in various different locations. They could include um, natural disasters, everything from fire, which is actually the most common natural disaster, to what we just saw with Hurricane Dorian. And how is that going to affect our business? Maybe it won't, but maybe it'll affect our customers. Maybe it'll affect one location in our business. When I worked at Great Dane Trailers and I want to say it was Hurricane Hugo hit, of course, it hit Charleston, but we had a location in Charlotte, North Carolina. And who knew that this was going to go all the way up to Charlotte? Nobody, Charlotte's far away from the coast. Nobody thought a hurricane was going to disable Charlotte. It disabled that branch for a week. So conditions are important to take into account as a business driver and also something we have to plan our security around. Information security activities. These directly support several common business drivers, including compliance and efforts to protect intellectual property, or what we call IP. They can also negatively affect business drivers, making it more difficult to satisfy your business objectives. Outside requirements. These direct how your organization carries out its tasks. The requirements come from legislation, regulation, industry demands, or even your own standards. And it's important to understand that regulation may not just come from the government. The PCI standard for the Payment Card Industry Association has nothing to do with the government. It's a private organization. But if you want to securely take credit cards and people to trust you when you take their credit card as a customer, You need to adhere to the PCI DSS standards, or you may not be able to use credit cards to pay for customers may not be able to use credit cards to pay for your product. So, despite the fact that we always think of the government as being a regulator, there are industry standards or industry demands that regulate our businesses too. Every organization has some requirements with which it must comply. There are multiple ways an organization can meet requirements. Most regulations require you to develop plans to handle business interruptions or disasters. Most activities that restore operations after an interruption support several different requirements. Well, first, we're going to talk about risk management. Now, risk management includes something important called risk assessment, but this is overall risk management. We will talk further about it later on in the course, but this is the introduction, you will say, to risk management. So let's go ahead and define it. It is the process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and addressing risks. And it is a process. It's not something that's just done one day. It's a process, and the process goes on over quite a bit of time. It ensures you have planned for risks that may affect your organization. Each part of the process is separate, but can and will occur many times. Risk management ensures that you have planned for risks that are most likely to have an effect on your organization. Surely in Savannah, Georgia, we're not planning for earthquake. But if you have a business here, of course, as we just saw, you're planning for hurricanes. So, again, that's are most likely to have an effect on your organization. A secure organization has these plans in place to address risks before the events occur. Since it is a process, it is not something you do just once and leave on the shelf. It must be done repeatedly. The resources involved include intellectual property, infrastructure and facilities, or employees. You have to do risk management for all of those various different components. Now, again, where it must be done repeatedly, it's not like you're going to create a new risk management document every day. That's not what this is all about. You may do this, go through the entire process and come up with a new assessment twice a year or four times a year. And a group of people will be involved in doing this every day, not all day. Maybe that's a team that meets together over time and comes up with a new assessment and how we should react to that assessment four times a year or twice a year. But it is a process, and it's not something that you just do once and say, I'm done, because you're not. Risk is, and this is an important definition, risk is the probability that an uncertain event will affect one or more of an organization's resources. Again, the probability that an uncertain event will affect one or more of an organization's resources. Now, the book talks about the project management body of knowledge, or the PMBOK. It is a best practices guide for project management maintained by the Project Management Institute. It states that the effects of risk can be positive or negative. You don't think of a positive effect of risk, but there are. It bases its risk management philosophy on a proactive approach, which simultaneously does the following. It minimizes the effects of negative risks, maximizes the effects of a positive risk. So what could a positive risk be? Well, the positive risk could be that we're going to build a new facility, manufacturing facility, or a new branch office or something in an area where it's prone to flooding. I'm not sure you would want to do that, but we might gain a lot of profit by putting that location in that area. But more likely, without regard to natural disasters, again, a positive risk, we've determined that building this facility, forget natural disasters, near a particular highway may give our product more access to large customers to come in and purchase our product, or to haul away our product, transport it to their location. And that's a positive risk. The risk, of course, is that we might make a lot of money, and we want to try and minimize the effect of a negative risk. But again, a positive risk is we're going to go out on a limb and build this facility and try and make more money, and that's a positive risk. And we have to think in terms of it's uh, doing that, the effect on our information security. Now we talk about risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. So a threat is the frequency of any event. In most cases, the events in the threat equation are negative or adverse events. A vulnerability is the likelihood that a specific threat will rather successfully be carried out, multiplying the probability of a threat and the likelihood of a vulnerability yields the risk of that particular event. Now, one problem with this is it's sometimes hard to figure out what the probability of a threat is. And it's also hard to figure out what the likelihood of a vulnerability is and reduce these to mathematical numbers. Obviously, probability would be reduced to a percentage, like 35% would be 0.35. But the idea here is that we have to come up with a mathematical formula, and risk equals the threat times the vulnerability. So the threat that a hacker may attack um, our database, there might be a 30% chance of that. And we might think, well, okay, so how often is that going to occur? It might occur once a year, twice a year. We don't really know. And that's where some of the data becomes hard to calculate because it's difficult to get some of the data. There's no actuarial table that gives you um, for this kind of business located in this country, what's the actual uh, frequency of this event occurring? It's hard to tell. How often do you get hit by a hacker? How often does an insider access your data illegally? That's something that's hard to come up with. But again, risks apply to specific assets or resources. Again, if you multiply that risk probability by the value of the resource, the result is the expected loss from exposure to a specific risk. And again, an exploited vulnerability results in an impact or cost. We will actually go through mathematical examples of this later in the course. Right now, we just have to understand that this exists. Okay, so defining risk management, the risk methodology is a description of how you will manage risk. It should include um, approach, required information, and techniques to address every risk. Approach defines how you will carry out the steps of the risk methodology process. For example, it could state that risk analysis will be conducted at specified intervals. Tools for conducting this analysis can include documents that define, categorize, and rank risks. The result of risk identification process is a list of identified risks called the risk register. The risk register, and this is important in terms of what it contains, important for you to know in terms of what it might contain, because you might be tested on this. And the risk register may contain a description of the risk, the expected impact of if the associated event occurs, the probability of the event occurring, the steps to mitigate the risk, the steps to take should the event occur, and the rank of the risk. Your company may quantitatively rank these risks from one to who knows how many in terms of the risks that your company faces. So again, this is something that you're going to need to know um, going forward. And again, I'll say it again, the risk register may contain a description of the risk, uh, the expected impact if the associated event occurs, the probability of the event occurring, steps to mitigate it, steps to take should the event occur, and the rank. Now, in obtaining information for the risk register, the methods of doing this include risk identification brainstorming meetings, formal surveys amongst people in your company, informal polls and requests for comments, and incentivized events such as um, lunch and learn sessions that include a forum for collecting comments and feedback. So now this is the longer part of this PowerPoint. Actually, the rest of it deals with most of the rest of it deals with this. And we're going to talk about implementing a business impact analysis, a business continuity plan, and a disaster recovery plan. So these protect an organization's IT resources and ensuring that events do not interrupt normal business functions. So a business impact analysis, it's a formal analysis of an organization's functions and activities that classifies them as critical or non-critical. Critical functions are required to run the business. If you cannot carry out a critical function, it causes unacceptable damage. Non-critical functions may be important, and you might miss them if they did not exist, but their absence would not stop an organization from conducting business. In the business impact analysis, each critical function is fully described in its own section, including a description of recovery goals and requirements for each function. Again, they identify the impact to the business if one or more IT functions fail, and they identify the priority of different critical systems, and not all systems are that critical as other systems. So the business impact analysis, recovery goals and requirements. So the first one is called the recovery point objective, or the RPO. This is measured in time. The RPO is the maximum amount of data loss that is acceptable. So you think to yourself, well, data loss, we're thinking in terms of a quantity of data. How could it be measured in time? But what we're looking at here is how much time will it take to restore the acceptable amount of data. It provides direction on how to back up data to meet that time limit, policies on recovery, and whether loss prevention or loss correction is a better option. And the best example, and I give this when I teach this face to face, so I'm going to go through it here. When I worked at Savannah Foods and Industries, we had a head crash. We lost basically access to our data. This was on a Wednesday morning. We sat there and we thought, well, we have this new product called Mimics, software that would actually was supposed to be mimicking our data and allow us to immediately recover what we had lost. So nobody had tested this software. So the thought was, well, we didn't really have a recovery point objective, but the thought was, how long will Mimics work to recover the entire database? Uh, and what we did was every Sunday we would back up the entire database, and then on Monday we would add, the adds, changes, and deletes, and on Tuesday we would put theirs into the system, and Wednesday so forth. So obviously, if we had to recover the whole thing, we would have to have restored from Sunday night, and then Monday nights adds, deletes, and changes, and Tuesday nights, and then we'd be missing about 2 hours Wednesday morning. So nobody knew what an RPO was. Nobody knew how long it would take to recover all that data. But the problem was nobody had tested Mimics either. So we figured we'll go with it because the CIO had bought this, even though nobody had tested it, didn't work. So we lost, I don't know, we lost most of Wednesday, if not all of Wednesday. I mean, somewhere around 7 o'clock at night, it was decided that this was not going to work. And later on, the CIO got fired. And this was just one of the many reasons why. But so what we had to do is we had to go back and use our regular methodology of doing the complete restore from Sunday night, and then the changes from Monday night and so forth, and Tuesday night, and then by golly and guess, what we had lost in an hour and a half or whatever it was Wednesday morning when the head crash occurred. So if we had an RPO, we would have known how long, what's the acceptable amount of time to restore 2 days full of data, or 3 days full. We didn't have that. And so we went and did this and we lost a lot of time. But that's why it's measured in time, not in quantity of data. Now, the recovery time objective sounds like it should be measured in time, and it is. It's the maximum amount of time, but to recover a function. In other words, a particular function, not data. So in terms of this, if, for example, your data was good, but I don't know, your entire manufacturing software went out, which I guess it could, or your marketing software, or your human resource software. How long will it take to restore that, as opposed to just the data? Now, business recovery requirements, these identify any other business functions that must already be in place for the specified recovery function to occur. These help in determining the recovery sequence. And lastly, technical recovery requirements. These define the technical prerequisites that are needed to support each critical business function. Okay, so the Business Continuity Plan, or BCP. This is a written plan for a structured response to any events that result in an interruption to critical business activities or functions. The order of priorities include the safety and well-being of people. It can't be stressed enough. Your number one priority in any kind of a situation where there could be a problem, uh, a natural disaster, for example, the safety and the well-being of the people that work for your company come first. Then the continuity of critical business functions and operations. You know, certain nice to have reports, well, they're just nice to have, and we're not going to ensure that they're up and running until we've got everything else up and running. That's crucial. The continuity of IT infrastructure components within the 7 domains of an IT infrastructure. So a formal business continuity plan, it isn't just helpful, in some cases it's required. It's required by industry organizations, by government, by shareholders. If you're a publicly held company, you are beholden not just to the government and not just to industry organizations, but the people who hold uh, stock in your company. The cost for system downtime can be extreme. It can result in lost customers, lost revenue, lost market share, additional expenses, damaged reputation. Organizations must consider contingency and recovery plans from a comprehensive perspective. Plans can't just focus on individual resources to the exclusion of others. Plans must address specific resources within a larger context. So the elements of a complete BCP. You have to have a policy statement defining the policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines for deployment. Project team members with defined roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. Emergency response procedures and protection of life, safety, and infrastructure. Situation and damage assessment. Resource salvage and recovery. A good example of that, the flood of 1994 at Great Dane Trailers. Our computer room sat only 4 feet off the ground. And this was no hurricane, it was just like 6 inches of rain in 2 hours. And the entire back lot on the corner of Bay Street and Lathrop Avenue was underwater. We actually had to leave. Um, we had 53-foot trailers floating in 4 feet of water. So the computer room got flooded. And when you talk about resource salvage and recovery, the IBM AS400, which I worked on predominantly, it actually had mirrored discs, one on the bottom of the machine, which is about 6 foot tall machine, and one on the top. So within a week, we had that cleaned out and ready to go, and data that was stored on the bottom was stored on the top, and we didn't lose anything. In the end, we didn't lose anything off our IBM mainframe either, but that mainframe, IBM 3083, we talk about resource salvage and recovery. We first were told to try and clean it out by our insurance company. That did not work. So we had to go find one on the open market and lease it and bring it in. Now, none of the data was lost, although some backup tapes were, but the actual hard drives were not lost. But we lost 3 weeks in trying to clean this machine out when that didn't work, and we had to go get one. It took months to recover all the data and get it entered into the system. Needless to say, Great Dane Trailers did two things. One, I guess both after I left, because I left in January 95 and this was October 94. First thing was they sued their insurance company for giving them bad advice. And secondly, they eventually built a second story computer room at the back of the building. Now, that building, you could actually see it today, but is now a Savannah PD police precinct. Great Dane has moved their operations. The factory has moved to near Statesboro, and the local uh, divisional office is, I want to say, on Chatham Parkway, but I'm not sure. But that's now, that building is where I worked, is now a police precinct in the corner of uh, Lathrop and Bay. So, but that's an example of having to go through salvage and recovery. Alternate facilities or triage for short-term or long-term emergency mode of operations and business recovery. When I worked at Savannah Foods, one of the things we had was the possibility of using what's called a hot site, which we'll talk about in a little bit, in Atlanta for all of our um, data processing. If a hurricane came and wiped out Savannah Foods or whatever, and the executives actually had rented, they had a standing contract to rent. There's a Holiday Inn. It used to be a Holiday Inn Express, I think, or a Holiday Inn on the corner of 441 and I-16 in Dublin. And I don't know what that hotel is now, but that's where they were going to go. The executives were going to go uh, with a hurricane. As a matter of fact, for Hurricane Floyd, they did. Um, and then they had to come back because Floyd didn't hit here. But that's an alternative facilities or triage for short-term, long-term emergency mode of operations. Okay, so disaster recovery plan. A disaster is an event that affects multiple business processes for an extended period of time. It causes substantial resource damage you must address before you can resolve business process interruption. The disaster recovery plan, and we could have an entire course in disaster recovery, includes specific steps and procedures to recover from a disaster. It's part of the BCP. It extends and supports the BCP. So here are specific steps. What are you going to shut down? What data? Where's data going to be backed up to? What are you going to do with your people? Uh, who are the important um, mission critical people that have to stay behind? Who else can be let go? What are their responsibilities? Where's senior management going to go? Do we have an alternate site to put our data in and run our programs on and so forth? So this is all has to be taken into account in a disaster recovery plan, which is not a one-page document. I mean, this is a lengthy, lengthy document if done properly. So you got to ask yourself, what's the difference between these two? So a BCP does not specify how to recover from disasters, only interruptions. An interruption could be 6 hours. So in general, an interruption is a minor event that may disrupt one or more business processes for a short period. Again, like when we lost our data and at Savannah Foods, that really was an interruption. It was would have required a BCP. It wasn't a disaster because it wasn't a long-term situation. Could have been if we had kept trying to use mimics, but anyway, it wasn't. Now, a disaster is an event that affects multiple business processes for an extended period of time. Disasters also cause substantial resource damage that you must address before you can resolve the business process interruption. So it could be fire is really the number one natural disaster that there is. But if you have substantial resource damage, like the flood of 1994 at Great Dane, where we lost our computers, and that wasn't even a hurricane. We all went to work. Well, we were told that was on a Wednesday. We were told just to come back on Monday, and we did. And by then, the backyard where they stored all the trailers had dried out. But there was no damage to Savannah. It's not like wind blew out every building or knocked down power lines or anything like that. But our business was affected significantly. And so that was a disaster to us, not to anybody else in Savannah. And we had that resource damage were the computers. And it was hard to do our work without them. I mean, especially when we were not in the back then we were not in the PC world yet at Savannah Foods. I mean, at Great Dane Trailers, and so it was tough. Now, a disaster recovery plan includes threat analysis, various impact scenarios, recovery requirement documentation, and disaster recovery itself. So, threat analysis is identifying and documenting threats to critical resources. Before you can recover from a disaster, you need to consider what types of disasters are possible and what type of damage they can cause. Common threats include fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, disease, cyber attack, sabotage. You could have somebody deliberately trying to destroy your equipment or your data, utility outage, and terrorism. With the exception of disease, each has the potential to damage an organization's infrastructure because disease, if it ever did happen, it really affects only personnel. The impact scenarios. So after defining the potential threats, you have to define the impact scenarios. These form the basis of your disaster recovery plan. Planning on most wide-reaching disaster rather than is on the most wide-reaching disaster rather than focusing on smaller issues results in a more comprehensive plan, because you need a comprehensive plan. Narrowing your focus onto smaller issues can result in a DRP that fails to consider a broader strategy. The DRP may include some specific scenarios, such as the loss of a specific floor in a building, but it really needs to be a comprehensive document. The recovery requirement documentation. Once the analysis phase is complete, you should document the business and technical requirements to initiate the implementation phase. You'll need access to asset information, including asset lists, and their availability during a disaster. Each asset has an owner who must grant access to it to the disaster relief team. A list of all asset information is on page 120, and a partial list is on the next slide. Disaster recovery. It's important to train all personnel on the proper response to any disaster. Common mistake is for personnel to be too eager to begin the recovery process. And a more detailed slide on this is 2 slides from this point. Okay, some information that must be readily available for the disaster recovery team. You have to have a complete and accurate inventory of all facility assets. And assets include everything from your IT assets, hardware, software, licenses, contracts. Do you have a maintenance agreement with somebody? Do you have insurance contracts on your equipment? And so forth. So those are just as important, and the licenses that go along with your software as the asset, as the hardware and software itself. A complete and accurate list of alternative office facilities and triage locations. Disaster recovery team member contact information, both their work contact information, who they are, what they do, what their roles are. Do they know what their roles are? Have they been trained in their roles in terms of disaster recovery? The detailed IT system, application data recovery procedures. The retrieval of backed up data for recovery and use. The disaster recovery team members and resources needed for manual and workaround solutions. And these people need to know who they are and what their roles are, and they need to be trained in them. That's the most important thing. Once they understand what their role is, they need to have had training to do it. So the critical steps in responding to a disaster include the following. Ensure everyone's safety first. No other resources as important as people. Again, going back to Hurricane Floyd at Savannah Foods, once we had evacuated and once we had gotten to where we were going, we had to report in to an 800 number and tell the corporation where we had evacuated to. That was the biggest disaster. I mean, it didn't hit Savannah really, but that's the reason why the contraflow is put in place on I-16 all the way to Dublin, because at that point, we only had 2 lanes of traffic going west and nobody going east. And people were on I-16 for 7 hours. Once we got where we were supposed to go, what we did was we tried back roads and realized, well, this isn't going to work. And then once we were on, we were near Reedsville, we heard on the radio, and this was really not supposed to be told to everybody, but Brad Huffines was the WSAV weather senior meteorologist, and he said, well, it's actually turning. And the National Weather Service did not want people to know. I don't know why they didn't want people to know this, because they didn't want people to get complacent, but the forecast show, I mean, we know more now, and we realize more now than we did 20 years ago. And so it was starting to turn away from Savannah, and he said it wasn't going to hit here. He got in trouble for that, but we were on our way, and we realized, okay, well, you know what? We're just going to go stay with our relatives in Statesboro. And that's what we did. When I got to Statesboro, I called the 800 number and told Savannah Foods where I was. Respond to the disaster before pursuing recovery. Required response and containment actions depend on the nature of the disaster and may not have anything to do with the recovery effort. So you have to respond to the disaster first before you figure out how to recover it from it. You need to follow the disaster recovery plan, including communicating with all affected parties. Once your people are safe and you have responded to the disaster, you can pursue recovery actions. So you need to wait until that has occurred before you start figuring out how to get the system back to the way it was. Now, disaster recovery is an extension of the DRP. It addresses recovering from common system outages or interruptions. So the deal on this, a disaster is generally larger than a common outage, and the resources may not be available to enact simple recovery solutions. For example, most database management systems enable you to quickly recover the primary database from a replicated copy. However, if disasters result in the destruction of your database server, you'll have to restore the server to a stable state before you can restore your database data. That was the same scenario with the flood at Great Dane. We had to restore a computer before you put anything on it, which means we had to go get one. The disaster may render your data center unusable. They had to clean that data center at Great Dane out before they could even get any machine up and running. And again, that took several days to do that, almost a week, really. Careful planning for such a move makes it viable. Moving your data center to another location is a major undertaking and involves many, many details. And here's some of the places you could, or types of places you can move it to. The hot site is the most expensive option, has environmental utilities, hardware, software, and data like original data center. Least amount of switch over time. So what we had a hot site in at Savannah Foods, we had a hot site in Atlanta and run by IBM. So we would go up there once a year and practice with subsets of our software. We'd load everything was there. The environmental utilities, the computer, our version of an IBM AS400 was there. Everything was there. We just loaded our programs onto the operating system was already there. Our version of the operating system. All we had, we paid for this. All we had to do was load our programs, load our data, and then go run it. And we would test that every year, and we would test different systems. So, like one year was my turn since I was in charge of purchasing and payables and receivables when it came to inventory control. I was involved with the sales side. So one year I went up there when we did this over a weekend and we ran, could we cut a purchase order? Could we put a requisition in to cut a purchase order from? What happened when the simulating data coming into inventory, would it go into the right systems? And so that was at the hot site in Atlanta that we leased from IBM. Now, a warm site is a little bit different, has environmental utilities and basic computer hardware. It's less expensive than a hot site, but requires more time to load operating system, software data, and configurations. A cold site is the least expensive option, has environmental utilities but no infrastructure, but has the cost of the longest switchover time since all the hardware, software, and data must be loaded at the new site. In other words, you got to bring your equipment. All they do is provide air conditioning, basically, and electricity. So you've got to bring your own computers, and that can become it may be inexpensive to lease, but it's there is a cost in getting not just your data there, but the actual computer there too. So if your company is uh, entertain the idea of a cold site, you might want to think twice about that. There are costs involved with it that are almost like hidden costs. And a mobile site is very flexible, fairly short switchover time, and widely varying costs based on size and capacity. Basically, you just need a trailer with necessary environmental utilities, and it can operate as a warm or a cold site. Now you have to validate your disaster recovery plan. You must validate your DRP for effectiveness and completeness and test it for accuracy. It's rare that the first version of DRP is complete and correct. You must test your DRP to identify gaps. Once the gaps are identified, you need to further refine it. You can engage a disaster recovery firm to assist in such tests if you can't do it yourself. Most effective tests simulate real disasters, including transferring software between the computer systems and ensuring you can establish communications at an alternative location. Okay, so this is the last slide in this presentation. And I know we've been going on now for almost 40 minutes, but I do want to emphasize that this is important information and you will certainly see this on a test. So you need to review this either here or in the static um, PowerPoint, which is, I think, not exactly the same as this, or in the textbook. But anyway, here are the different tests. A checklist test. This is the simplest type of DRP test. Each participant follows steps on the DRP checklist and provides feedback. Use them for DRP training and awareness. A structured walkthrough. It evaluates the DRP's effectiveness, also called a tabletop exercise or conference room test. A simulation test, more realistic than a structured walkthrough. Also, when it comes to a simulation test, the DRP team uses role playing and follows through with as many of the effects of a simulated disaster as possible without affecting live operations. A parallel test. This evaluates the effectiveness by enabling full processing capability in an alternative data center without interrupting the primary data center. But of course, this is rather costly because you're running, a parallel test somewhere else. At the same time. And this is though what we would actually do at Savannah Foods when we'd go up to the hot site in Atlanta. And a full interruption test. This is the only complete test, interrupts the primary data center and transfer processing capability to an alternate site. It is very, very expensive because you are interrupting the entire business to do this. Okay, so this is the end of part one. And again, like I said, I know this is rather long, but this is the kind of lecture I would have actually given if you were in physical class with me. So it's important to, I do think it is important to review and listen to this lecture. And this is the end of part one, and I'll be coming up with part two shortly.